Guys, I'd like to present to you Mr. Sebastian Bergman, who probably doesn't need too much introduction. As you already know, he's the author of PHP Unit, which must be the de facto standard for testing in the PHP world. Every single serious PHP project I've seen is using PHP Unit to unit test and assert that stuff works. He's also author of other security tools like the PHP copy-paste detector and PHP walk, and he's also a wonderful guy, which I had the pleasure to welcome to Sofia today.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. And I'm not talking about PHP Unit today. Not really, anyway. So this talk, it's titled How to Get Ready for PHP 7, How to Prepare for PHP 7. My goal for this talk is mostly to mentally prepare you for the awesomeness of PHP 7. So normally, these kinds of talks start with, these are all the awesome things. This is something else. Then, the climax goes down and not really interesting anymore. This is the things that we had to do under the hood to make this all the awesome things work. And in the last minute, oh, by the way, these are the things that are going to break. Questions? No questions? OK, off I go and leave you alone with your problems. So I want to do it a little bit differently. So I'm going to start. Well, maybe I should actually start. So hi, I'm Sebastian. I do things with PHP for a really long time now. PHP has its 20th anniversary this year, and for about 17 of those years, I've been involved in the PHP community in one way or another. With these two gentlemen, I founded a company a couple of years ago with which we help PHP development teams build better applications, make better use of the PHP platform. So 20 years of PHP. What does that mean? So we have 2015, PHP 7 is almost out. That's what this talk is about. So 20 years ago, Rasmus published version 1.0 of something he called personal homepage tools. Then, a little bit later, PHP FI came out. Then PHP 3, PHP 4, PHP 5, 11 years ago. And then, well, already somebody this morning asked me, why is this not PHP 6? This is not the question that I would like to answer. So around 2007, 2008, 2009, we were hard at work on PHP 6, which we never delivered, because we realized at some point that the big goal or the way of implementing the big goal or vision we had for PHP 6 is not the right approach or was not going to work out. So we released PHP 5.3, which was, if you do a little bit of math, PHP 5.3 was PHP 6 minus the Unicode stuff. However, this burned the version number 6 because publishers. There are plenty of books out there that talk about PHP 6 and MySQL 6. There is no MySQL 6. There is no PHP 6. There will never be PHP 6. But it's one of the top-selling PHP books, PHP 6, because that's a bigger version number than PHP 5. And it's completely wrong what's in there, because that's about pre-alpha software that we never released and never intend to release. So when we prepared this new version that is about to come out, the first major new version since PHP 5. Of course, it should have been PHP 6 for all the logical reasons, but these illogical reasons, publishers, PHP 6 books, we didn't want to confuse users. We labeled it 7, and at the end of the day, it's just a version number. We could have just as well named it PHP 2015 or PHP insert crazy name, I don't know. It doesn't really matter, it's just a name. So if you look at these dates in a little bit different, from a little bit of a different angle, look at the lifetime of this. So first version was the current major version for 2 years. PHP 2 was only the current major version for 1 year, which is good. But still, there are sites out there on PHP-FI. PHP 3 was current for only 2 years. PHP 4 was only current for 4 years, but even 10 years later, there's still a lot of PHP 4 code running. Why? Because we made the mistake when releasing PHP 5 not to give a clear deadline for an end of life for PHP 4. That's not going to be the case with PHP 7. If you look at this page on php.net today, you'll see this. This is a really great page, which we didn't have until a couple of months ago, when I wanted to show something like that and asked on an IRC channel, where can I find the current end-of-life dates for PHP versions? Oh, we don't have that. So within an hour, somebody from the community sent the pull request for the PHP website and said, hey, here's this new page, which was really awesome. So you can look at this calendar and see today, 26th of September 2015, the only actively supported version of PHP is PHP 5.6. Active support for 5.5 ended 2 months ago. So, and yes, this means active support for 5.6 will end in 11 months. By that time, only 7 will be actively supported. You have another year after that for security fixes, but it's really time to think about PHP 7 now. So, as I already mentioned, I would like to try for this talk to start from the bottom up. What did we have to change under the hood to make all the awesome things possible? It all started with the executor. Like 2 years ago, work on the PHP NG branch started, completely rethinking the way we execute PHP bytecode. What does that mean? PHP is now able to execute the PHP bytecode, the intermediate representation compiled from your source code, faster and using less memory. So just to give you a little bit of a hint of what that means, being faster to execute, benchmarks. This is PHP 5.6 running PHP unit with a small unit test suite. For this unit test suite, there's only one really interesting number here. We need 304 million, whatever, really long number. It's low-level CPU instructions to execute that code and put to use the code that you wrote. In PHP 7, we get the same stuff done with 30% less CPU instructions. And of course, the less the CPU has to do, the less instructions it has to execute, the faster it is. So how much faster, you may ask? So here's a PHP unit test suite with 450,000 tests using 710,000 assertions, no I/O, real unit tests in the truest meaning of the word. With PHP 5, it takes 150 seconds roundabout to execute this test suite. With PHP 7, it takes 49 seconds. That means it's 2.8 times faster. This is not a synthetic benchmark. You can look, oh, and it also uses 25% less memory. So this is a real-world benchmark from a real-world test suite with a real-world tool, something that you use every day in your development, or should be using every day in your development. There are other benchmarks out there in presentations that Rasmus gives at the moment, and he benchmarked everything, WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, Magento, whatever, and across the board you see performance improvements without changing a single line of code from 200% to 300%, sometimes more, sometimes less. It's really incredible. Of course, lies, damn lies, and benchmarks. So I did this at home in a virtualized Linux. I don't have a unit test suite lying around with 450,000 unit tests. Sorry, even I'm not that crazy or have that many tests. But there's this really interesting feature in PHP unit that I implemented over 10 years ago that I never used until now, which is called --repeat, which just executes your tests 10,000 times if you want. So that's how I benchmarked. So more changes under the hood. So we can execute bytecode with less CPU instructions, but it's also really good to improve the bytecode that we generate. So this really simple piece of code in PHP 5.6 leads to 10 opcodes on the lowest level. This is what bytecode looks like. If you have never seen PHP bytecode, you don't have to know how this works or what this does. If you're interested, or if you ever done assembly language, like me, I learned programming a really long time ago using Motorola 68K assembly language on the Amiga. I'm currently relearning that, just for fun, on the weekends. So we need 10 low-level instructions to run that piece of code, and with PHP 7, it's 7. So we generate less code that needs to be executed, and we can execute the code faster. That's awesome. So now some next level up. So we have bytecode execution, bytecode generation. The thing before that is making sense out of the code that the PHP developer has written. That's what the parser does. And I don't really know what the correct term for the way is that we used up to PHP 7, because it was not really a standardized way of generating bytecode or trying to comprehend source code. But now we have the right way to understand the source code, which is using an abstract syntax tree. So now, an intermediate representation, even before the bytecode that we execute, is a tree structure like this. This makes to people working on compilers and interpreters much more sense than the non-standard, really obscure way of doing things that we did in PHP 5. As the end user of PHP, you don't really have an immediate benefit from this, but this makes it so much easier to add new syntax features to PHP. This is what made it possible with really little effort to implement the new syntax features that I'm going to talk about later. Because this makes it much easier, much safer. I can now add new syntax to PHP with much less risk of breaking something that used to work before. Another benefit of this is we are able to expose that data structure to Userland. So we can now build applications in PHP that have access to this data structure to reason about the source code. This will ring in a new age of tool development for PHP. Tools were already mentioned yesterday in the tutorials, or even earlier, tools like, I don't know, PHP copy-paste detector or PHP mess detector. They can now operate on this useful structure and not have to build a structure like that themselves, which runs out of date with each new version of PHP as the syntax evolves. This can never run out of sync with PHP, because this is provided by PHP. So this is what you get on the command line if you just dump the data structure for the code that I showed earlier. There's a command line tool that Rasmus is currently working on called FAN, PHP Analyzer, with the clear goal that he stated that this hopefully becomes obsolete at some point, because he really does not want to build such a tool. It's just a demo of what can be done with this, and hoping to inspire others to pick it up and re-implement those tools using this new foundation. Even before we get to the parser makes sense out of words of a language. So I have if and for. Does this make sense on the same line or not? But we also need to recognize these words before we can do something in the parser with it. That's the first step that happens in trying to understand what source code does. It's the lexer. And we were burdened by a limitation in our lexer for a really long time, because we had only, keywords of the language were reserved. I was not able to use words like if or for as function names or method names or as attribute names. So that's now possible. The keywords of the PHP language are now semi-reserved, which means all of these keywords can now be used as names for attributes, constants, and methods in classes, interfaces, and traits. There's one exception. You are not allowed to use the word class as the constant, as the name of a constant in the class, because that is a predefined constant of PHP that contains the fully qualified name of that class. So this allows developers to finally write code like this, if you really want to. Funny thing is, that code is syntactically correct on PHP 5, but it wouldn't work because what's not valid on PHP 5 is to declare a method named for or and on the class. So using that was already supported, but declaring it wasn't. Okay, so that was the fundamental things that we did under the hood to enable all of the other interesting things, like the performance improvements and the new syntax features. Of course, things like these come at a price. And the price that we pay for performance improvements and new productivity features are backwards compatibility breaks. We try to minimize them as much as possible, but things like the abstract syntax tree would not have been possible without cleaning up a lot of messy edge cases that hopefully nobody ever used, and hopefully nobody will ever miss, but we needed to clean that up. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to come up with the abstract syntax tree. So some really bizarre features or variable syntax constructs changed their meaning between PHP 5 and PHP 7. So if you use code like that, it now has a new meaning. The PHP runtime itself is not able to detect that because it's not an error. It's just interpreted differently. However, using static analysis, you can find these places. So that's one of the features that Rasmus has built into his fan tool. You can run fan on your code base, and it will tell you where you have potential problems stemming from changes to how PHP interprets variables. Also, if you look at PHP's wiki for the RFC process, you'll find the RFC wiki page for uniform variable syntax, which has a list of all the things that used to be ambiguous and now have different meaning than what it was in PHP 5. But hopefully, you don't have this problem. There were one or two places in the WordPress code base, if I remember, and in the Magento code base where they needed to change that. And it's not really a problem that you have to change something like that for a new version of PHP, because that's code that you don't really want to have in the begin with, to start with. So this is what hit a couple of projects. We have some new reserved keywords. Why? Get to that in a bit. There were some projects, for instance, that had, I think Drupal had a class named string. String is now a reserved word. So if you have a class named string, you need to rename it. We finally removed a lot of functionality that has been marked as being deprecated for ages. Yeah, so xereg, POSIX compat, no, that's really old regular expressions. You don't want to use them. They don't know about binary safety. They don't know about Unicode. They regularly lead to security issues because you're using them wrong. Don't use them anymore. Use PCRE. The MySQL extension has been marked as deprecated for a long time. The MySQL team and now Oracle says for years, don't use this. it does not support the latest features or features that have been added in the last 10 years or so to the MySQL client-server protocol. Unnecessary things like compression and encryption and security and so on, right? Stuff that nobody needs. So do yourself a favor and use MySQLi, or if you have to be compatible with multiple database systems, use PDO, using the MySQL driver, and don't use XMySQL. This was really popular in PHP 4. Wasn't really necessary in PHP 5 anymore, but people were still using it. Sometimes it could lead to really bizarre edge cases when used with PHP 5 because you try to solve a problem that no longer exists, leading to new problems. So this no longer works. Also incompatible this context. Yeah, don't do that. Preg replace. We talked about regular expression earlier. So preg replace no longer supports the eval modifier. So use a callback for that. Make it explicit what's supposed to happen. Interesting thing with regard to PHP 4 style constructors. That led to the first thing, to the first RFC, or not really RFC yet, but for the first plan for PHP 8. We don't know when that will come out. Hopefully not in 10 years. Hopefully also not next year, but somewhere between, I don't know, a couple of years would be nice. So in PHP 7, PHP 4 style constructors are marked as deprecated. So you get a warning if you still have them somewhere. In PHP 8, they will just be ignored. So in PHP 8, if you have a class that has a method that has the name of the class, it will not be treated as a constructor. That's the best thing that we could come up with to make it a smooth transition out of this stuff that should have been gone a really long time ago. So all of these things aren't really that bad. Yes, you need to invest a couple of hours or days to look at your code base to figure out, am I affected by uniform variable syntax changes? Am I still using XMySQL? Usually, and I've seen that with a couple of teams that I worked with over the years, usually migrating the code base from XMySQL to XMySQLi takes a day. It's not really that big of an issue, but it has to be done. And it's the price that you have to pay to get up to 3 times better performance. And I don't know about you, but that's the price that I'm willing to pay for that. And on the other hand, PHP 5 has now been around for 11 years. And during that 11 years, every year there was a major, or there was a version of PHP, a new release of PHP 5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and so on, that added new features and really hadn't that many of backwards compatibility issues. So you basically got all these new functionalities and performance improvements for free. After 11 years, you have to pay the price. Right? So let's talk about new features. And there are so many new features in PHP 7 that I cannot talk about all of them. Sorry about that. So, and of course, I'm biased in my selection of the features that I'm going to show you. So I'm looking at them, what do they mean for me as a developer of PHP Unit, and what do they mean for the users of my tools? So for me personally, one of the biggest improvements is that we almost have no fatal errors anymore. Fatal errors are a thing of the past. So, yes. It's really annoying if you write a test with PHP Unit and you are doing test-driven development and you create an object of a class that doesn't exist yet and you want to do something with it. Yes, your IDE tells you that class doesn't exist. And then you run the test, and the test tells you that the class doesn't exist, but it aborts the execution of PHP unit because PHP ran into a fatal error. So that same situation with PHP 7 looks like this. Execution continues afterwards, and you will get a nice error message from PHP unit saying, hey, this test, it ran into an error. It was not successful, and this is why it failed. It wanted to instantiate a class that doesn't exist. Do something about it. Oh. While we're talking about PHP unit, to some people, this is really a really big change. This is coming in PHP unit 5.0. So if your test suite has less tests, then it would take dots to fill the line. Before, you wouldn't get the statistics at the end of the line. Really important. Not going to devaluate that contribution. It's a really valuable contribution, but this is just one change. So in case you're wondering why, when you run a test suite with less than 60 tests or something, you don't see that. One of the minor new features in PHP Unit 5, which will be out next Friday. So talking about PHP Unit, again, I'm biased when it comes to these features. PHP 7 has built-in support for code coverage. You don't need an additional extension anymore to get code coverage data. It's not perfect yet. It's still actively being worked on. It probably will take a while until it's as good and reliable as Xdebug, but hey, nothing like this happens overnight. Derek has been working on Xdebug's code coverage feature for 10 years. And over the years, we ran in so many weird bug situations with getting code coverage information from the engine. So as of PHP 5.5 or 5.6, there's a new debugger for PHP that ships as part of PHP called PHP DBG, which is implemented as a separate command line interpreter. So you need to run your applications through that to debug it with PHP DBG. And PHP DBG, as of PHP 7, has code coverage support. So you need to run PHP unit through PHP DBG to use the built-in code coverage functionality for your test suite. And this is how you do it. You just say PHP DBG, really cryptic, -QRR. -Q is easy. That's be quiet. Don't give me debugging information while you're running this. R means I'm not just interested in debugging that file or that tool in that case, but also run it somehow. And the second R, I forgot. It's PHP DBG will tell you what this means. -help usually helps. And that's currently the only way to get code coverage information on PHP 7, because Derek is still working on porting Xdebug to PHP 7. Like I mentioned all these changes under the hood. It's not that much of an effort to upgrade or migrate a regular extension for PHP from PHP 5 to PHP 7, but it's a whole different story for an extension such as Xdebug that integrates so deeply with the execution engine, and that just takes some time. Talking about extensions that hook really deeply into the execution engine, bytecode caching. AppCache, the PHP bytecode cache that is shipped with PHP as part of the official releases since PHP 5.5, has learned a couple of new tricks, one of which is the secondary file-based storage for AppCache. Before, AppCache was basically used, or bytecode caching was basically useless on the command line. Now, it makes sense to use AppCache on the command line. So why would you want to do this? If you have a really big code base and you have a big test suite, and you want to run your tests, you spend somewhere between 5 to 10% of your time running the test suite in compiling the PHP code. And usually when you work on the big code base, you don't change everything at once. You're basically working on a couple of files, and only they change between the invocations of PHP unit. And using the secondary file-based storage for AppCache, you can cache the compiled representation of your application between the PHP unit runs. Improves PHP unit test suite execution for large code bases by 5%. So another added benefit. Now we come to the interesting syntax additions, return type declarations. So we finally can declare the return type for a function or method. In this example, we have a method named m, which declares I return an integer. And if you return something that is not an integer, you will get a type error. So you see a fatal error. So fatal errors are still gone. They don't exist, but they only come up if you have an exception that is not handled. So in this case, at the point in time where we have the return statement and we return a string, a type error exception is raised. And actually, the type error is not an exception, but an error, and I'm responsible for that not being an exception because at some point I yelled and we need different hierarchies, inheritance hierarchies for these internal exceptions and the external exceptions to make it really clear and not run into really weird situations like this one in PHP unit. So we have now in PHP 7 an interface named throwable, and we have two base classes, exception and error. Both implement throwable. And errors cannot be thrown from userland. Only exceptions can be thrown from userland. But anyway, at this point in time, it says I only return integer, and we are returning a string. A type error is raised, which is not handled, which leads to a fatal error in the end. So that's type declarations. We also have scalar type declarations, and to make it more interesting, we have two flavors of it. We have coercive scalar type declarations, which means I can put my type declarations into the signature of my function or method and say, it would be really nice if you give me a string. And if you don't give me a string, whatever you give me, it will automatically cast to a string. So this already helps with documenting your code, documenting the intent for how you want to work with the data that you get as arguments. This already helps or provides a lot of useful information for static analysis tools that can detect, okay, you have something here, a method that wants a string, but on this place right here, you call that and you don't give it a string, you give it a bool or an integer. So this is something that you might want to look into. So we say here we want a string, an int, and a float. And then we call it with an int instead of a string, with a string instead of an int, and with an int instead of a float. And it does the casting. It changes if we go from coercive scalar type declarations to strict scalar type declarations. And we do that by declaring on a file-by-file basis how we want to handle these scalar type declarations. If you put at the first line or at the very top of your PHP source code file, declare strict types equals 1, you turn on strictness. Some people call it everything related to strictness, the German mode. I don't know why, but leave that up to you. So now, when we have a declaration here, I want a string, and I don't call it with a string, I get a type error. Argument 1 passed to m must be of the type string, integer given. I stop. Go fix your shit. Right? So the language is yelling at you that you're not adhering to the contract that you put into the signature of the method. This works extremely well for new code, makes it really easy to be very precise and clear in new code that you write about how you want to handle the arguments. Over the last week or so, I started to migrate the PHP unit code base, which is 15 years old by now, to be type strict. And I ran into all sorts of really interesting issues. And I'm sure they will also affect anyone or most of the people that migrate or plan on introducing strict typing into a legacy code base. But that's not really a problem because, as I mentioned earlier, it's on a file-by-file basis. You don't have to change everything at once. You can start with the most important pieces of your applications, make it strict, see what fails, fix the failures, move on. We now have support for anonymous classes. I've never missed them. So far, I don't know if I'm ever going to use them, but they're there. They were missing. So you can just say, hey, $O equals new class, and then start doing something, and then write the class, and that's like an anonymous function, but it's a class. And of course, and that's probably the only valid use case that I see seeing myself being useful at some point in the future. You can implement an interface, and you can also extend the class. So sometimes it might be useful to say, hey, I have this interface here for logging something, and I need a one-off implementation of that logging. So $logger equals new class implements logger interface, method log, do something. For testing, maybe. I don't know. What they are used for in some situations in other languages that have had them for a while, like in Java, for instance, people use anonymous, or some people prefer using anonymous classes for stubbing and mocking over framework-assisted things like mock object libraries. So you don't say, hey, get mock, give me something that looks like this real thing. So you just create on the fly an anonymous class that implements the interface that you want to stop and put the implementation in there. I don't know if you're going to see this use case or if this is useful. It's there, it works. We have two new operators. The null coalesce operator that allows you to do this. Right? Two question marks, new operator. And another operator that led to quite a lot of discussion with regards to how to name it. Both how to name it from the end user perspective and how to name it internally, how to name the token that represents the new operator. So other languages have had a combined comparison operator for quite a while, which is this one. And then all hell broke loose. People say, oh, that's a TIE fighter. No, that's a TIE bomber. No, that's a TIE interceptor. No, that's Darth Vader's very special prototype TIE Advanced. I don't know if it even really looks like a spaceship. I mean, with a lot of fantasy, it looks like some sort of TIE fighter. I don't know. It's most people refer to it as the spaceship operator. To be honest, I don't really care what it's called because it's useful in those situations where you want to sort something using usort and you need an anonymous function to implement the sorting that you want to do. And writing this little piece of code, less than 10 characters or so, instead of this is awesome. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a whole lot more features that I didn't get the time to talk about today. Go forth and experiment with it. Again, don't download it during the conference. I mean, the source code is just 12 megabytes or so. So that's OK. But what most people do to test this is use Rasmus's Vagrant box, for instance. But that's a 2 gigabyte download or so, right? So be nice to your network neighbors. Don't do this here. Do it at home. There are also Docker files flying around that give you various flavors of Linux distributions with PHP 7 installed. And just try it. Try it out. Report bugs. We're currently preparing release candidate 4. Report bugs now so we can fix them before we release the final version. Thank you.
Guys, if you have any questions, we can spare a few minutes for Q&A session, like a quick one. And then afterwards, I guess Sebastian will be happy to answer your question outside as well. Yeah. But we do have time for at least a few questions if you want to. Question here and here, guys. Just to wait for our mic runners, they'll be around you and they'll be helping you so that you don't have to shout to the whole room. This is what mic runners are supposed to do, run with the microphone. Run!
There's somebody running.
There.
Hi, I have a question about the new feature that allows us to declare the returning type of a method and declaring the strict types of the function parameters. Does this mean that PHP are going toward the overloading of methods like in Java? Will it be possible soon?
So, that's a really good question. Trying to find a really short answer, and I failed because it's already taken longer than to give you the long answer to begin with, so sorry about that. So, with all the changes that we've done in 7.0 under the hood, with the abstract syntax tree and changes to the infrastructure, it's now a whole lot easier to implement what you're asking than it was before. And in my opinion, from the experience that I have had so far with writing new code using PHP 7, it will eventually become a necessity to add that feature. It's the logical, in my opinion, it's the logical next step. Some other people are already talking about this and try to prepare or thinking about preparing an RFC for PHP 7.1. Maybe we'll not see it in PHP 7.1 next year, but maybe in PHP 7.2 in 2 years. I don't know. It would make me very happy. There was another question over there.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, very nice talk.
Thank you.
I'm sure that most people liked it. So yeah, I have two questions. The first one is like, even though we have namespaces in PHP, the standard library is not divided into namespaces.
Yes.
So yeah, my question is, are there any planned improvements on that? Because the standard libraries, like, it seems to get bigger, and this could help like our organization on the organization aspect.
There are no plans for that. It's a topic that comes up a lot. It would be a really, really big backwards compatibility break, one that is not really worth the effort, if you ask me.
Okay, and the second question was about generics, because after this strict types and everything, it's close to the mind.
There's an RFC for generics for PHP 7.1 with an experimental patch as of 2 days ago. I don't know if they will be, if this RFC will be accepted. There has not been a vote yet. I don't know if this feature makes it in, if it will look like what the RFC says right now. We'll have to see. The guy who proposed the RFC says, I'm only just learning C and how to implement stuff for PHP, how to extend PHP. I need help with that. So he's probably not the person who does the final implementation. So even if the RFC is accepted, we need somebody to implement it. But it's a topic that's currently being discussed. How likely it is that it makes it into it, I don't know at this point.
Thank you.
One last question, please.
One last question.
Do you establish the syntax for generics in PHP?
Sorry?
Establish the generic
Yeah.
in PHP, a syntax for that. Other in different language in PHP.
Sorry, I don't really...
So a syntax.
Syntax, yeah.
For generic.
I don't know it. I saw the RFC. I haven't looked at it.
Okay. Thank you, and please thank Sebastian once again.